There's a stretch of Corporate Parkway in Libertyville, Illinois, about 40 miles north of downtown Chicago, that looks like every other office corridor in the American suburbs. Trimmed hedges, wide parking lots, buildings with tinted glass that reflect nothing interesting back at you. The kind of place you'd drive past on your way to somewhere else without slowing down, without a second glance, without any reason at all to look twice. But if you pull over and walk up to one of those buildings, you'll notice something. A name, faded in some places, removed in others, but still visible if you know where to look. Just old signage now, could be any company that downsized, any tenant that moved on. But if you know what that name means, if you know what was built inside these walls, then standing here feels like visiting a cathedral after the congregation has left and no one remembers what it was for. Because this is where Motorola lived, where engineers built the first portable cell phone ever carried by a human hand, where in 2006 this company shipped 217 million phones in a single year, roughly one for every 3 people in the European Union, the second largest phone maker on the planet. A name that meant American technology the way Ford meant American cars, designed, tested, and shipped from right here. Now there's leased office space and smaller companies with no connection to any of it, and most people who drive this road every morning have no idea what happened in these buildings. That's the thing about industrial erasure. It's quieter than people expect. A bankruptcy leaves a courthouse record. A factory fire leaves a ruin. Motorola didn't give you that. It just slowly stopped being Motorola. What was left behind is the architecture, glass and steel and parking lots built for thousands, used by dozens. Whether that was a monument or just leftover real estate, nobody seems quite sure. But there it is. The name, half visible on a building that outlasted the empire it was built for. The memorial nobody planned and nobody visits. We tell the stories behind the world's greatest rises and falls. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now, let's get back to the story. In 1928 in Chicago, a man named Paul Galvin bought a bankrupt battery company at auction for $750. Galvin was 33 years old, a World War I veteran who had already watched one business fail during a downturn. He was not a dreamer. He was a tinkerer with a stubborn streak and a habit of showing up at the factory floor before anyone else arrived. The company he bought had nothing, no brand, no product line, no reason for anyone to remember its name. Within 2 years, Galvin and his engineers built a car radio that could be installed in any vehicle, and he gave it a name that sounded like motion and music fused together. Motorola. Motor for the car. Ola for sound, a word invented for a product that did not exist until Galvin decided it should. That instinct, build the thing before the market asks for it, would define Motorola for the next 70 years. During World War II, the company made portable radios for the United States military, the SCR-300 backpack units that soldiers carried across Europe and the Pacific. After the war, Galvin's son Bob took the company deeper into electronics, pushing into semiconductors, televisions, two-way radios for police departments, and taxi fleets. By the 1960s, Motorola was not a gadget company. It was an infrastructure company. Its technology sat inside the systems that made American communication work, from squad cars in Detroit to mission control in Houston. But the moment that matters most for this story happened on April 3, 1973, on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan. A Motorola engineer named Martin Cooper, a wiry, restless man who had been fighting internally for years to convince leadership that portable phones were the future, stood outside the New York Hilton on 6th Avenue and placed a phone call on a device that weighed about 2.5 pounds and looked like a brick with an antenna. He called Joel Engel, the head of the rival program at Bell Labs, and told him he was calling from a real handheld cellular phone. The call lasted roughly 2 minutes. It was the first public mobile phone call in history, and Cooper made it not from a lab, not from a press stage, but from a sidewalk, in traffic, like a man proving that the future would be ordinary. It took another decade to bring that future to market. In 1983, the Federal Communications Commission approved Motorola's Dynatac 8000X, the first commercially available portable cellular telephone. The development program had cost roughly $100 million over more than 10 years, a figure that, adjusted for inflation, would be over $300 million today. The phone itself cost nearly $4,000 at retail, weighed close to 2 pounds, and offered about 30 minutes of talk time. Almost nobody could afford it. Almost nobody needed it. And yet it changed everything, because it proved that a telephone did not need a wall or a cord or a car. It just needed a pocket. Eventually, Motorola did not just invent the portable cell phone. It owned the idea of what a mobile phone was supposed to feel like. Engineered, American, aspirational. Through the 1990s, the company released the Micro-Tac, the first true flip phone, and then in 1996, the StarTAC, which weighed just 3.5 ounces and became one of the most coveted consumer electronics products on the planet. Celebrities carried it. Executives carried it. The StarTAC was a status object disguised as a communication tool, and Motorola understood that duality better than any competitor alive. By the turn of the millennium, Motorola had been in the communications business for 7 decades. It had built radios for soldiers, pagers for doctors, phones for presidents and pop stars. It employed tens of thousands of people. It operated on 6 continents. When people in the industry talked about the history of the mobile phone, they did not start with Nokia or Samsung or Ericsson. They started with Motorola, because Motorola had started first. And then, in 2004, a team inside the company created one more product that would define an era. It was thinner than anything on the market. It was beautiful in a way phones had not been before. It sold roughly 130 million units over its lifetime, a number so large it meant that for every 20 human beings on Earth, one of them bought this phone. They called it the Razr. The Razr was supposed to be proof that Motorola still understood the future of mobile. Instead, it became the last thing Motorola understood before the future left it behind. The Razr did not start as a mass-market product. It started as a vanity project. In 2003, a small team inside Motorola's design division in Libertyville, Illinois, was given an unusual mandate: build the thinnest phone physically possible. The team leader was Roger Jellicoe, a British-born engineer who had come up through Motorola's European operations and had a reputation for being obsessive about industrial design at a time when most phone engineers still thought design meant choosing a plastic color. Jellicoe's team worked in relative isolation. The phone they produced was just 13.9 millimeters thick, roughly the width of a pencil. It had a chemically etched aluminum keypad, an internal antenna, and a silhouette that looked more like a luxury cigarette case than a telephone. When they presented it to senior leadership, the initial production plan was modest. This was supposed to be a boutique device, a halo product, something to remind the press that Motorola could still surprise. The market had other plans. The Razr V3 launched in the third quarter of 2004, priced at around $500 with a carrier contract. It sold out. Then it sold out again. Carriers demanded more units. Motorola ramped production. By 2005, the price had dropped and the Razr was everywhere, in hip-hop videos, on red carpets, in the hands of college students and business travelers and teenagers who wanted the thinnest, coolest object in their pocket. For a stretch of nearly 2 years, the Razr was not just the best-selling Motorola phone, it was the best-selling phone on Earth. Inside Motorola, the Razr's success created a sensation that felt like vindication. The company had been losing ground to Nokia in global market share through the early 2000s. Nokia was disciplined, methodical, relentless about releasing phones for every price point in every region. Motorola's lineup had felt scattered. The Razr changed that overnight. Suddenly, Motorola was the company with the product everyone wanted, the phone that made Nokia's plastic rectangles look dull. And here is where the trap closed. When a company produces a genuine cultural hit, it faces a decision that is almost never framed as a decision at the time. The choice is this: treat the hit as a moment and start building the next era, or treat the hit as a model and keep replicating it. Motorola chose replication. After the original Razr, the company released the Razr V3i, the Razr V3X, the Razr 2, the Razr Max. New colors, new finishes, slightly updated specs. The fundamental product idea never evolved. Motorola was selling thinness and style in a market that was beginning to care about something else entirely. Because while Motorola was polishing the Razr formula, the rest of the industry was moving toward a different kind of phone. In January 2007, Research in Motion's BlackBerry had already captured the corporate world with push email and a physical keyboard that made executives feel productive. Nokia was investing heavily in its Symbian software platform. And on January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced a device with no keypad at all, just a glass screen you touched with your finger. The iPhone was not yet a great phone. Its first version could not even copy and paste text, but it understood something that Motorola had stopped paying attention to. The phone was becoming a computer, and the value was moving from hardware to software, from how thin the device was to what you could do inside it. Motorola had no answer, not because it lacked engineers, not because it lacked money, but because the entire company was organized around a philosophy that the Razr had reinforced. Phones win on industrial design and carrier relationships. Software was an afterthought. The operating system was a means of making calls and displaying a menu, not a platform for applications and services and content. Motorola had multiple software platforms running simultaneously across its product lines, none of them competitive with what BlackBerry, Apple, and soon Google were building. The Razr had not just been a product, it had become a worldview, and that worldview was now obsolete. In 2006, at the height of the Razr's commercial peak, Motorola shipped 217 million phones. That is roughly one phone for every 3 people in the European Union. The company held an estimated 22% of the global handset market, second only to Nokia. Revenue was enormous. The brand felt invincible. But buried inside that year's annual report was a detail that almost nobody outside the company noticed at the time. Motorola's own management admitted that the mobile devices segment had disappointed in the second half of the year. Sell-through was slowing. Average selling prices were falling. The Razr was still moving units, but only because Motorola kept cutting the price, which meant every phone shipped was worth less than the one before it. The peak was already hollow. Motorola just had not stopped to listen. The numbers arrived like a verdict. In 2007, Motorola's mobile devices segment posted a 33% drop in net revenue compared to the year before. Shipments fell from 217 million units to 159 million, a loss of 58 million phones in a single year, which is roughly the entire population of Italy simply vanishing from the customer base. The segment recorded an operating loss of $1.2 billion. Not a dip, not a correction, a billion-dollar wound in 12 months. What made the damage feel earned rather than unlucky was this. The global handset market was still growing. Nokia was still growing. Samsung was still growing. The tide was rising, and Motorola was sinking in the middle of it. This was not an industry collapse dragging everyone down. This was one company falling through a floor that it had built for itself out of a single product idea, repeated too many times. Ed Zander was running Motorola during this period. Zander had come to the company in 2004 from Sun Microsystems, where he had been president. He was a New Yorker, fast-talking, confident, a networker who had spent his career in enterprise technology and had little instinct for the consumer handset business. His early tenure coincided with the Razr explosion, which made him look brilliant by association. But Zander had not created the Razr. He had inherited its momentum. And when that momentum faded, he had no second act to offer. By the time the 2007 results landed, Zander was already under siege from the board. The problem was not just leadership, it was deeper, structural, and cultural. Inside Motorola, the handset division had grown bloated during the boom years. Chicago Magazine later described a company riven by warring tribes, fiefdoms that competed internally as much as they competed with Nokia or Samsung. Engineers who had worked on the Razr carried a status that distorted decision-making. Teams duplicated effort across multiple software platforms that were incompatible with each other. There was no single, coherent operating system strategy, no unified vision for what a Motorola phone should do beyond make calls and look good. Meanwhile, the competitive landscape was not just shifting, it was being rebuilt from the ground up. By late 2007, Apple had shipped its first iPhone and was already working on the App Store, which would launch the following year and redefine what a phone was for. Google had announced Android, an open-source mobile operating system designed to give every handset maker access to a smartphone platform. Research in Motion's BlackBerry was the dominant device in corporate America, with push email that made executives feel like they could not live without it. Even Nokia, for all its later failures, was investing in software through Symbian and later Memo. Motorola had none of this. Its phones ran a patchwork of proprietary and licensed software systems that could not compete with any of these platforms on capability, developer support, or user experience. The company that had invented the portable cell phone was now selling devices that felt like relics in a market, moving toward pocket computers. Reuters captured the situation in blunt terms. The Razr had aged, its successors were not original enough, and consumers were gravitating toward devices built around music, imaging, email, and the emerging smartphone experience. By the end of 2007, Reuters reported that Motorola's global market share had fallen to roughly 12%, down from 23% just a year earlier. That is not a decline. That is a halving. Imagine a country losing half its territory in 12 months, not through invasion, but through its own citizens quietly walking across the border. The cruelest part of 2007 was not the financial loss. It was the clarity. By the end of that year, everyone inside and outside Motorola could see what had happened. The company had ridden one product for too long, failed to invest in software, failed to build a platform, and now faced a market where the rules had changed and its playbook was useless. The diagnosis was obvious. The cure was not. Because fixing Motorola's phone business was not a matter of designing one good phone. It required rebuilding the entire foundation, the operating system, the developer ecosystem, the relationship between hardware and software, the way the company thought about what a phone was supposed to do. That kind of transformation takes years. Motorola did not have years. It had quarters, and each quarter the losses got worse, and the competitors got further ahead. Zander resigned in early 2008. His replacement was Greg Brown, a Motorola veteran who would eventually steer the company toward its split. But before any restructuring could begin, Motorola had to survive 2008, and 2008 would be worse than anyone expected. Greg Brown took the chief executive role in January 2008, and the company he inherited was bleeding from every direction. Brown was a West Point graduate, disciplined, measured, the kind of executive who spoke in complete sentences and preferred operational clarity over spectacle. He had spent years running Motorola's government and enterprise communications businesses, the divisions that sold radios to police departments and infrastructure to telecom carriers. Steady, profitable, unglamorous work. Now he was being asked to save a consumer handset division that was burning through cash faster than any turnaround plan could contain. The 2008 numbers were catastrophic. Mobile devices' net revenue fell to $12.1 billion. The segment posted an operating loss of approximately $2.2 billion, nearly double the previous year's loss. Shipments collapsed to 100 million units, down from 159 million the year before. To feel that number, in 2 years, Motorola had lost more than half its phone volume. The company that shipped 217 million phones in 2006 was now shipping fewer than half that, while the global market continued to expand around it. But the raw financial damage was only part of the story. Inside the company, leadership made a decision in 2008 that was meant to stop the bleeding, but instead deepened the wound. Motorola announced it would consolidate its scattered software and silicon platforms into a more focused architecture. On paper, this was rational. The company had been running too many incompatible systems across too many product lines for too long. Simplification was overdue. The problem was timing. Consolidation meant writing off inventory, abandoning products mid-cycle, and absorbing $370 million in excess inventory and related charges. It meant that Motorola was not just losing the race, it was pulling over to rebuild its engine while every other car on the track accelerated past. The consolidation also exposed a deeper failure. Motorola's own filings admitted that the company had a limited product portfolio in critical market segments, especially 3G smartphones. This was 2008. The iPhone had launched the previous year. The App Store opened in July 2008 and attracted 10 million downloads in its first weekend alone, a number equivalent to every person in the city of Seoul picking up their phone and downloading an app on the same Friday. BlackBerry was dominating enterprise. Google's Android was months away from its first commercial handset, the T-Mobile G1. And Motorola, the company that had created the first portable cell phone 25 years earlier, was publicly acknowledging that it did not have competitive products in the segment that now mattered most. The smartphone gap was not an accident. It was the accumulated cost of every year Motorola had spent optimizing for the Razr model instead of investing in a software-centered future. Every dollar spent on another thin flip phone variant was a dollar not spent on an operating system, an app ecosystem, a developer platform. Every quarter spent chasing the next Razr-like hit was a quarter not spent understanding why the iPhone was different. The bill had come due, and the total was measured not just in money, but in relevance. There were human consequences, too. Motorola announced thousands of layoffs during 2008, cutting across divisions as the company tried to shrink its cost structure to match its shrinking revenue. People who had built careers around Motorola's phone business, designers, engineers, supply chain managers, salespeople who had relationships with every carrier on the planet, were told their positions were eliminated. The halls that had hummed during the Razr years were quieter now, and the quiet was not metaphorical. Outside the company, analysts and journalists were already writing the obituary. The question was no longer whether Motorola could regain its position as the number 2 handset maker in the world. The question was whether Motorola's phone business could survive at all. Some argued it should be shut down or sold. Others suggested the company should retreat entirely to its enterprise and government businesses, where margins were stable and the competitive dynamics were less brutal. Brown did not shut it down. Instead, he began laying the groundwork for 2 decisions that would define Motorola's final chapter. The first was a leadership change for the handset division. The second was a structural separation that would split Motorola into 2 entirely different companies. Both decisions would arrive in 2009 and beyond, and both would carry their own complications. But before those moves could take shape, something else happened. A man named Sanjay Jha received a phone call, and that call would give Motorola one last chance to matter in the smartphone age, not as an empire, but as a survivor. Sanjay Jha was not a Motorola lifer. He was an Indian-born engineer who had spent 14 years at Qualcomm, the San Diego chipmaker whose processors powered most of the world's mobile phones. At Qualcomm, Jha had risen to Chief Operating Officer, overseeing the technology that sat inside devices made by Samsung, LG, Nokia, and yes, Motorola. He understood mobile hardware at the silicon level. More importantly, he understood the ecosystem shift that was remaking the industry. The move from hardware-defined phones to software-defined platforms, where the operating system and the App Store mattered more than the antenna or the hinge. In August 2008, Motorola announced that Jha would become co-chief executive, running the mobile devices division, while Greg Brown continued to oversee the rest of the company. It was an unusual structure, 2 CEOs for one corporation, and it signaled something that everyone inside Motorola already understood. The phone business and the enterprise business were no longer living in the same strategic universe. They would need to be governed separately before they could be separated entirely. Jha arrived with a thesis that was simple and ruthless. Motorola could not build its own mobile operating system. It did not have the time, the talent pool, or the developer relationships to compete with Apple's iOS or the emerging Android ecosystem. The company had spent years maintaining multiple proprietary platforms, and all of them were dead ends. The only viable path was to pick one external platform and commit to it completely. Jha picked Android. The logic was sound. Android was open source, backed by Google's engineering resources and advertising revenue, and designed to be adopted by any hardware manufacturer. It gave Motorola access to a modern smartphone operating system, a growing app store, and Google's search and mapping services without requiring Motorola to build or maintain any of that infrastructure itself. In exchange, Motorola would sacrifice differentiation. Every Android phone would share the same basic software, DNA. The competition would shift to hardware design, price, carrier relationships, and marketing, areas where Motorola still had muscle, even if that muscle had atrophied. Jha did not hedge. Motorola's 2011 annual filing would later state it plainly. The company's strategy was to concentrate its portfolio on smartphones and rely predominantly on Google Android and its ecosystem. That word, predominantly, was the tell. This was not a company dabbling in Android while keeping backup options alive. This was a company putting everything on one bet because it had nothing left to bet with. The first major product of the Android era was the Motorola Droid, launched in November 2009 on Verizon Wireless. The marketing campaign was built as a direct attack on the iPhone. Where Apple's advertising was soft, warm, human, the Droid campaign was aggressive and mechanical. The tagline, "Droid does," listed everything the iPhone could not do at the time: run multiple apps simultaneously, work on Verizon's network, offer a physical keyboard. Verizon poured enormous marketing dollars behind the launch because the carrier needed a flagship smartphone to compete with AT&T, which had exclusive rights to the iPhone in the United States. The Droid worked. Not as a cultural phenomenon like the Razr, not as a world-changing object like the iPhone, but as a commercial product that proved Motorola could still build a phone people wanted to buy. It was the best-selling Android device of its launch period. It brought Motorola back into conversations about smartphones. It gave Verizon a credible iPhone alternative, and it stopped the free fall. By late 2010, the results were tangible. Reuters reported that Motorola's phone unit posted its first quarterly profit in more than 3 years. Full-year smartphone sales were expected to land at the high end of 12 to 14 million units. After years of billion-dollar losses, the handset division was finally producing black ink instead of red. But scale tells the real story. 12 to 14 million smartphones in a year was a meaningful number for a company that had nearly died. It was not a meaningful number for a company that had once shipped 217 million phones in a single year. Motorola had gone from being the second largest phone maker on the planet to being a mid-tier Android manufacturer competing with HTC, LG, and a rapidly rising Samsung for shelf space in carrier stores. The Droid did not restore the empire. It kept the lights on in what remained of it. Jha understood this. The Android bet was never about reclaiming Motorola's old position. It was about creating enough value in the handset business to justify its continued existence, either as a standalone company or as an acquisition target. And justifying its existence was about to become very important because Motorola was preparing to do something it had never done in its 80-year history: split itself in two. On January 4, 2011, Motorola Inc. ceased to exist. In its place stood two separate publicly traded companies: Motorola Mobility, which held the consumer handset business and the set-top box division, and Motorola Solutions, which inherited the enterprise and government communications operations, the radios, the infrastructure, the steady contracts with police departments and utilities and military agencies. The split had been announced in 2008 and debated internally for even longer. But now it was real. A company that had operated as a single entity since Paul Galvin bought that bankrupt battery business in 1928 was now two companies with two stock tickers, two boards, and two completely different futures. Greg Brown took Motorola Solutions. Sanjay Jha took Motorola Mobility. The division was clean in corporate terms, but brutal in symbolic ones. Motorola Solutions got the stable revenue, the long-term government contracts, the margins that did not depend on whether a teenager in Tokyo preferred your phone over Samsung's. Motorola Mobility got the brand recognition, the patent portfolio, and the smartphone business that was alive but fragile, profitable in recent quarters, but still a fraction of what it had been. The patent portfolio mattered more than most people realized at the time. Over its decades in mobile communications, Motorola had accumulated roughly 17,000 patents covering everything from cellular network architecture to antenna design to video compression. In the smartphone wars of the early 2000s, patents were not just legal protections, they were weapons. Apple was suing Android manufacturers for copying the iPhone's design. Samsung was countersuing. Google was watching its Android partners get dragged into courtrooms and realizing that Android's growth depended on having a patent shield strong enough to deter litigation. 7 months after the split, on August 15, 2011, Google announced it would acquire Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion. That is roughly $40 per share, a 63% premium over the previous day's closing price. Larry Page, Google's co-founder, who had just retaken the CEO role earlier that year, framed the deal publicly as a commitment to Android and a defense against anti-competitive threats from companies using patents aggressively against the ecosystem. The number was enormous: $12.5 billion for a handset company that had posted billions in operating losses over the previous 4 years and was only recently profitable again. But Google was not buying Motorola's phone business. It was buying Motorola's history, specifically the intellectual property that history had produced. The patents were the prize. The phone division was the cost of acquiring them. Inside Motorola Mobility, the acquisition created a strange limbo. Employees now worked for Google, one of the most powerful technology companies on Earth, but Google had no obvious interest in running a hardware business that competed with its own Android partners like Samsung, HTC, and LG. If Google favored Motorola's phones with early access to Android updates or exclusive features, it would alienate the partners who were responsible for the vast majority of Android's market share. So Google kept Motorola Mobility at arm's length, funded but not favored, owned but not embraced. Jha departed in 2012. His replacement was Dennis Woodside, a Google veteran who had run the company's America's sales operations. Woodside oversaw the development of the Moto X, a phone built in a factory in Fort Worth, Texas, that was marketed as the first smartphone assembled in the United States. The Moto X was well reviewed. Critics praised its ergonomic design, its voice activation features, and its customization options. It was a good phone. It was not a phone that could rebuild an empire. Sales were modest. The Fort Worth factory, which employed roughly 2,000 workers at its peak, would close within 2 years of opening. A factory that opened with a press tour and a promise and closed before most consumers knew it existed. That is the image that captures this phase of Motorola's story. Ambition that was real, but arrived inside a structure that no longer had the power or the independence to sustain it. By 2014, Google had seen enough. The patents were secured. The phone business was not transforming into anything strategically essential. On January 29, 2014, Google announced it would sell Motorola Mobility to Lenovo, the Chinese computer manufacturer, for approximately $2.91 billion. Google kept the vast majority of the patent portfolio. Lenovo got the brand, the product line, and roughly 3,500 employees. The math was staggering. Google had paid $12.5 billion. It sold for less than $3 billion. The difference, roughly $9.5 billion, was the price Google assigned to those patents and the strategic breathing room they provided for Android. For Motorola, the meaning was different. The company that Paul Galvin started for $750, the company that Martin Cooper used to prove that phones could be portable, the company that defined American mobile communication for 3 generations, had been bought, partially stripped, and resold in less than 3 years. There is a temptation when telling a story like this to frame the ending as death. Motorola did not die. The brand still exists. Lenovo still sells Motorola phones today, mostly in Latin America and parts of Asia and Europe, where the name still carries enough residual trust to move units in the mid-range market. Motorola Solutions, the enterprise side of the split, became a quietly excellent company, growing steadily in public safety communications and analytics. Greg Brown built it into a business worth tens of billions. The Motorola name survived. What did not survive was the thing the name used to represent. What Motorola lost was sovereignty. For most of the 20th century, Motorola was one of a handful of American companies that could claim to define an entire technology category. It did not just participate in mobile communication, it set the terms. When Motorola built the Dynatac, there was no market waiting for it. Motorola created the market. When Motorola released the StarTAC, it did not follow a consumer trend. It invented one. The company operated from a position of authority so deep that its engineers and executives believed, with some justification, that they understood the future of phones better than anyone alive. That authority is what the Razr era destroyed. Not because the Razr was a bad product, it was a brilliant product, but because its success convinced the company that the future of phones was still about hardware elegance and carrier distribution. Motorola looked at the Razr's 130 million units sold and saw confirmation. What it should have seen was a closing window. The last moment when a phone could be a massive global hit purely on the strength of how it looked and how thin it was, without offering a software platform, an app ecosystem, or a reason for developers to build for it. The competitors who won the next era understood this. Apple built iOS and the App Store, creating a closed ecosystem where hardware, software, and services reinforced each other in a loop that generated hundreds of billions in revenue. Google built Android as an open platform and gave it away, monetizing through search and advertising while letting hardware partners compete on price and features. Both strategies treated the phone as a computer that happened to make calls. Motorola, even at its Razr peak, was still treating the phone as a communication device that happened to look good. The strategic distance between those two worldviews was the distance between empire and irrelevance. and it could not be closed by a single product, even one as successful as the Droid. The Droid proved Motorola could execute on someone else's platform. It did not prove Motorola could lead. Leading required owning the software layer, owning the developer relationship, owning the ecosystem that made customers stay. Motorola had owned none of those things since the feature phone era, and by the time it embraced Android, it was a tenant in Google's house, not a landlord. This is why the Google acquisition and the Lenovo sale were not betrayals. They were consequences. A company that does not own its platform is, ultimately, a contractor. It builds hardware to someone else's specifications, competes on margins that someone else's software defines, and survives at the pleasure of partners whose strategic interests may not align with its own. Motorola under Android was a very good contractor. It was no longer an empire. The human cost is harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. Thousands of engineers, designers, and managers who had spent their careers at Motorola watched the company they knew dissolve in stages. First the losses, then the layoffs, then the split, then the sale to Google, then the resale to Lenovo. Each stage carried its own small devastation. A retirement plan tied to a stock that cratered. A team relocated or disbanded. A building in Libertyville or Schaumburg that went from bustling to half-empty to closed. These are not numbers that appear in annual filings, but they are the texture of what industrial decline actually feels like when it is happening to real people, in real offices, in real American suburbs. The broader pattern Motorola represents is not unique to phones. It is the pattern of incumbency misread as destiny. A company dominates an era, mistakes its dominance for proof that the era will continue, and then discovers too late that the rules have changed. The specific mechanism varies. Sometimes it is technology, sometimes regulation, sometimes consumer taste. But the underlying error is always the same. The company stops asking what could replace its current success and starts assuming that current success is self-sustaining. Motorola asked that question in 1973 when Martin Cooper made his sidewalk phone call. It asked it again in 1996 when the StarTAC redefined what small meant. It stopped asking somewhere around 2005 when the Razr was selling faster than factories could build it. And by the time it started asking again, the answer was no longer its to give. If you drive to Libertyville, Illinois today, you can still find traces of what Motorola was. The town sits about 40 miles north of Chicago, quiet, suburban, unremarkable to anyone passing through on Route 21. Motorola's campus there was once one of the premier corporate research facilities in the United States, a place where engineers worked on everything from semiconductor design to the next generation of mobile handsets. The buildings are still standing. Some have been repurposed. Others sit partially vacant, leased to smaller tenants who have no connection to the company that built them. The Motorola name is not on the door. The lobby does not tell the story of Martin Cooper's phone call or the Dynatac or the Razr. It is just a building now, doing what empty buildings do, holding space where something used to matter. That image is worth sitting with because it contains the real lesson of this story. Motorola's collapse was not dramatic in the way Hollywood would script it. There was no single catastrophic day, no explosion, no villain twirling a mustache in a boardroom. There was instead a long, slow withdrawal of relevance, quarter by quarter, product cycle by product cycle, decision by decision, until the company that had defined American mobile communication for 3 generations was no longer defining anything at all. 3 lessons live inside that silence. The first is that a hit product is not a strategy. The Razr sold 130 million units and made Motorola feel invincible. But a product, no matter how successful, is a snapshot of what the market wants at a specific moment. Strategy is the architecture that lets a company keep meeting the market as it changes. Motorola had a product. Apple and Google had architectures. When the moment passed, Motorola had nothing underneath it. The Razr was a peak disguised as a foundation, and Motorola built on it as if the ground would never shift. The second lesson is that platform ownership is the difference between sovereignty and tenancy. Motorola made beautiful hardware for decades. But when the value in mobile shifted from the device to the software running on it, Motorola had no platform of its own. It had no operating system that developers wanted to build for. It had no app store that consumers depended on. It had no ecosystem that locked customers into a cycle of loyalty. When it finally adopted Android, it regained competitiveness but surrendered independence. Every Android manufacturer was, in the end, building market share for Google. Motorola went from being the company that owned the phone to being one of dozens competing to assemble Google's vision of what a phone should be. The third lesson is the one that applies beyond phones, beyond technology, beyond any single industry. Legacy is not protection. Motorola's history was extraordinary. First portable cell phone, first flip phone, decades of engineering firsts, cultural icons from the StarTAC to the Razr. But the market does not grade on history. It does not award points for what a company did in 1983 or 1996 or 2004. It asks one question relentlessly, every single quarter. What are you offering now? Motorola spent too many years answering that question with variations of the same product, and by the time it tried to answer with something new, the market had already given its attention to companies that arrived with answers Motorola had not even considered. Paul Galvin bought a bankrupt battery company for $750 in 1928. From that purchase, he built a communications empire that helped win a world war, put the first portable phone in a human hand, and made America believe that the future would always be something you could carry in your pocket. His son continued the legacy. His engineers changed the world. For a stretch of decades, Motorola was not just a company. It was a promise that American ingenuity and miniaturization and sheer technical ambition could keep producing miracles, one product generation after the next. The promise was real. The mistake was believing it was permanent. From 217 million phones shipped in 2006 to 100 million in 2008. From 22% of the global market to a brand sold twice in 3 years. From the company that taught the world how to carry a phone to a name on devices assembled for someone else's ecosystem in someone else's factories under someone else's strategic vision. Motorola did not collapse because it stopped being good at making phones. It collapsed because making good phones stopped being enough. The industry moved to platforms, ecosystems, and software, and Motorola kept perfecting hardware in a world that had already decided hardware alone was not the future. The empire did not fall to a rival. It fell to a question it refused to ask until the answer no longer belonged to it. Drive through Libertyville today. The buildings are there. The name is mostly gone. And if you listen carefully, past the traffic and the suburban stillness, you might hear what the end of an industrial era actually sounds like. Not a crash, not a bang, just the long, steady quiet of a company that once built the future and then, one decision at a time, let the future leave without it.